I trained, because my mother was a war widow, I had what was called a Rehabilitation Benefit or allowance. And I received from the government for my physiotherapy, I received the vast sum of £2.10 a week. That would be $5. And that was considered very generous in those days. But because I didn't have a standard physiotherapy bursary, I did not have to work anywhere where I sent when I graduated. So I received £2.10 a week throughout my training for all 3 years of it, and at the end of my training I was free to go anywhere. Everybody else got placed in certain hospitals and areas over the country. Now, my mother had come from Australia. She had married a New Zealander and come back to New Zealand with him, which is how I happened to be in Gisborne. But he was killed in the war, as I've just said, so I had this rehabilitation bursary. But by the time I graduated, my mother had gone back to Australia where her family lived. So when I graduated, I packed up and went and worked in Horsham, which is in Victoria, in Australia, and I worked there for a year. And when I was told the starting salary over there in Australia that year, I was most impressed. I remember it was a lot, anyway, by New Zealand standards. I nearly flipped. That the hospital board I worked for was the Wimmera, that is WIMMERA, hospital board, as opposed to the Woomera, where the rockets are fired from. But I worked there from Horsham. I was a travelling physiotherapist, and I went from Horsham each day to a different country hospital. So I had an interesting year, but I would never ever recommend it to a new graduate because I was totally on my own and I thought I knew it all. And that year I thought I knew it all. By the next year I was realising that I knew very, very little. So it was not a good decision. It was a lovely year. I had a lot of fun. I had the freedom to travel and be my own boss. And I covered this vast area, going to 7 different hospitals. But it was not a good idea for a new grad. But it didn't stop me enjoying it. Then I came back because my now husband by then had chased me to Australia and asked me to marry him, so I came back and we settled in Christchurch, where I worked at the Christchurch Hospital and later up at the Coronation Hospital, which no longer exists, but in those days it was a geriatric hospital and also had a TB annex high on the hill. It was positioned in Kashmir. I worked there from beginning of 1964 until the end of 1965, and then I stopped working because I had children. But all the time I had children, I continued to take antenatal classes, which I enjoyed, and I there had a lot of interest in giving people a lot of education. I remember a big birth atlas book, a book of photographs of plaster models, which I thought was a wonderful way of illustrating the events of childbirth and educating the patients on the stages of labour, their breathing techniques and behaviour during labour, relaxation techniques. And I must admit it stood me in very, very good stead when I had children. So I took the antenatal classes, but then we moved to Kaikoura, and that was in 1970. There was a physiotherapist working in Kaikoura. Her name was Mary Gordon, and Mary's husband was one of the local GPs, and she was working as the physiotherapist there. But I helped her by doing relief work for her, and then eventually we job shared, and I took over part-time, and then eventually always part-time, but I took over fully. Mary retired, and we were in Kaikoura until 1984. Again, I was working on my own, but did have the background support of the Christchurch Hospital. I did postgrad refresher courses, and I came to Christchurch and did any course I possibly could because I felt isolated and I felt I needed that background or that education. But in Kaikoura, of course, you treated anything and everything that came through the door, and so that gave me a very, very broad experience of all manner of physiotherapy work. But we chose to return to Christchurch in 1984, and that was the time when I went to Margaret Draper, who was then in charge of all physiotherapists from as far north as Kaikoura, as far south, I believe, as Ashburton, and as I heard her say recently, even as far east as the Chatham Islands. And I think it included Hanmer, but didn't go over to the west coast. So she was in charge of all the Canterbury, or the North Canterbury Hospital Board, as they were then, patients, or staff at least, physiotherapists. And I went to her and I asked her, Margaret, we're moving back to Christchurch. Is there any chance I could get a job in Christchurch? Now, I know it didn't happen like this. I know very well it didn't. But my memory of that day was that Margaret leant forward across her desk, glared at me and said, would you be prepared to go out to Sunnyside? And I absolutely panicked. Oh, my goodness. But I needed a job, and here was a job. Margaret assured me it would only be for 4 months, and after 4 months everybody could rotate and I could come back to Christchurch Hospital. So we came to Christchurch, and I started work at Sunnyside Hospital in the middle of winter. I don't know the exact date, but it was snowing, I remember, because I couldn't get the bus to work. The buses were all off the roads because of the snow. But I got to work eventually and started there, and instead of staying there for 4 months, I stayed there for just on 19 years. So I found a wonderful place to work. So that's where I got my interest in working with mental health. And I gave a talk to a conference one day, and I titled it, A Vacancy Waiting to be Filled, Physiotherapists and Mental Health. And I still feel very strongly that we have a vacancy waiting to be filled. Physiotherapists should be working in mental health. So it's my theme, my campaign. I loved Sunnyside. I loved working there because at that time there were 600 patients and 600 staff, but it was like a little village community. I remember when I started there, I had absolutely no understanding of mental illness. And when I first heard that someone was being discharged, I looked at the staff member with absolute astonishment. Discharged? You mean somebody could come to Sunnyside and be discharged? I just had no knowledge or recognition of the fact people could get better. I learnt. It was one very steep learning curve. When I went there, I felt I had absolutely no qualifications to equip me to work with mental illness. I had my physiotherapy background, my physiotherapy training, a very general and broad background in physiotherapy, and I had 4 teenagers. That was the thing I thought that made me most equipped. The fact that my children ranged from 19 down to 13 made me most equipped to work in mental health.